The city lights blurred into a hazy glow. Daniel hurried along the slick sidewalk, his briefcase clutched tight. Another late night at the office, another missed dinner with Sarah. He reached the towering glass and steel structure that housed his firm. Stepping inside, Daniel shook the rain from his coat and crossed the polished marble floor. He swiped his security badge, the elevator doors sliding open with a soft whoosh. Something about the man's posture seemed vaguely familiar. The way he held himself, a quiet stillness that seemed at odds with the bustling energy of the city. Daniel couldn't place it, but something about the man tugged at the edges of his memory. He glanced at the man's reflection in the mirrored wall of the elevator. His face was etched with lines, each one telling a story of time and experience. His eyes, though, held a strange intensity. They were sharp, alert, as if every sense was tuned to its highest frequency.
Long day? You could say that. I've been waiting here a long time.
Daniel shifted uncomfortably, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end.
Waiting for someone?
Daniel asked, trying to sound casual. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed a little too sharp.
You could say that. I've been waiting for years.
The elevator lurched slightly, sending a jolt of adrenaline through Daniel. He glanced at the control panel. They were still ascending, but the floor indicator was blank.
Is something wrong with the elevator?
Daniel asked, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. The man didn't answer, his gaze fixed on Daniel with an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely hypnotic. The elevator lurched again, more violently. The lights flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness. When the lights sputtered back on, the man was standing closer, his face inches from Daniel's. His breath was cold on Daniel's cheek, carrying a faint, metallic scent.
This is my floor, and you're coming with me.
Daniel's life was a tapestry woven from routine. Each day echoed the last, a predictable rhythm of work, meals, and fleeting moments of rest. He woke before the sun, the insistent chirping of his alarm clock, a jarring counterpoint to the quiet stillness of their small apartment. Sarah, his wife, would stir beside him, her warmth a comforting presence against the chill of the early morning. A quick kiss, a shared pot of coffee, and then he was gone, swallowed by the city's insatiable appetite for time and ambition. The subway was a cacophony of noise and motion, a sea of faces etched with the weariness of countless commutes. Daniel would lose himself in the pages of his newspaper, the rustling of the pages, a flimsy barrier against the crush of humanity around him. He barely noticed the scenery anymore, the graffiti-strewn tunnels blurring into a monotonous backdrop. His mind was already at the office, reviewing spreadsheets, anticipating deadlines. He cherished the stolen moments with Sarah, the shared laughter over takeout dinners, the quiet intimacy of their Sunday morning rituals. They had talked about starting a family, but the timing never seemed right. There was always another project, another deadline looming on the horizon. He promised himself things would be different, that he would find a way to slow down, to savor the precious moments that slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. But the city had a way of pulling you back in. its relentless energy both exhilarating and exhausting. Daniel found himself caught in its grip, his days and nights blurring into an endless cycle of work and obligation. The elevator was a part of that routine, a metal box that transported him to and from his sterile, predictable world. He had never given it much thought before, never considered the possibility that it could be anything more than a means to an end. But tonight, something felt different. The air inside the elevator seemed thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pregnant with a sense of foreboding. The man's words echoed in Daniel's ears. "I've been waiting for years." A cold dread settled in the pit of Daniel's stomach, a feeling that he was caught in something sinister, something beyond his comprehension. The elevator continued its ascent, a steel coffin carrying Daniel further and further away from the familiar world. He stood there, rooted to the spot, as the man's words echoed in the silence. "This is my floor." His voice was a raspy whisper devoid of warmth, sending chills down Daniel's spine. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand there like a deer caught in headlights. Yet his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed by an unseen force, a terror that seemed to seep from the very walls of the elevator itself. The man's eyes, sharp and piercing, held Daniel captive. They seemed to bore into him, seeing past the facade of composure, into the deepest recesses of his soul. Daniel tried to speak, to break the suffocating silence, but no words came out. Suddenly the elevator shuddered to a halt. The lights flickered violently, plunging them into darkness for a heart-stopping moment. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the emergency lights flickered on, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced across the confined space. Daniel's eyes darted around the elevator, searching for any sign of an escape. The control panel, usually a beacon of hope in such situations, was dark and unresponsive. He was trapped at the mercy of this strange, unsettling man and whatever fate he had in store. As his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small, almost imperceptible crack ran along the back wall of the elevator, just wide enough to suggest a space beyond the metal confines.
Looking for a way out?
He rasped, his voice barely audible above the low hum of the emergency lights.
There's no escape from destiny, Daniel.
Daniel whirled around, his heart pounding in his chest.
I know many things, things that would make your blood run cold. What do you want?
Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. The man leaned in close, his breath hot and fetid on Daniel's cheek.
I want you to remember. Remember who you are. Remember what you've done.
Daniel stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What was this man talking about? What could he possibly know about his life? About his deepest, darkest secrets? The elevator lurched again, this time with a sickening grinding sound that seemed to reverberate through Daniel's very bones. He had to make a choice, face his fear and confront the man, or succumb to the terror that threatened to consume him. The silence in the elevator was deafening, It pressed down on Daniel, suffocating him, amplifying the frantic beating of his own heart. He stared at the man, his eyes searching for any flicker of humanity in those dark, fathomless depths. But there was nothing, only a chilling emptiness that mirrored the growing void within him. The man's words, cryptic and menacing, echoed in the silence. Remember who you are. Remember what you've done. What had he done? Daniel racked his brain, desperately trying to make sense of the man's words. His life had been so ordinary, so unremarkable. He was a good man, a loyal husband, a dedicated employee. He had never intentionally hurt anyone, or had he? A memory unbidden and unwelcome surfaced from the depths of his mind. A rainy night, much like this one. He was driving home from work, exhausted and preoccupied with an upcoming deadline. He hadn't seen the figure step out into the road until it was too late. The sickening thud, the blinding headlights, the scream that died in his throat. He had kept driving. Panic welled up inside him, cold and suffocating. He had tried to bury the memory, to convince himself it was just a nightmare. But the man's words, his eyes, had ripped the scab off an old wound, exposing the raw, festering guilt that lay beneath. "No," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "That wasn't me. It couldn't have been." Terror, raw and primal, surged through Daniel. He stumbled back, his hand connecting with the crack in the elevator wall. It widened slightly, revealing a glimpse of darkness beyond. "Daniel, what are you?" Daniel stammered, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?"
The man stepped closer, his shadow enveloping Daniel like a shroud. "I am what you made me," he hissed, his breath hot and fetid on Daniel's cheek. "I am the embodiment of your guilt, your shame, your deepest fears."
He reached out, his hand cold and skeletal, and placed it on Daniel's chest.
"You cannot hide from yourself, Daniel."
The man whispered, his voice a low growl that seemed to emanate from the depths of Daniel's own being.
"Your sins will always find you."
The elevator lurched violently, throwing Daniel to the floor. He looked up, his vision blurry, and saw that the crack in the wall had expanded into a gaping maw of darkness. From the depths of the abyss, he heard a chorus of voices, whispering his name, chanting his sins.
"Welcome home, Daniel. We've been waiting for you."
The elevator floor seemed to dissolve beneath him. Daniel fell, tumbling into the swirling vortex of darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, oppressive, like being dragged down into a cold, airless grave. Screams echoed around him, disembodied and full of unimaginable suffering. Faces, contorted in agony and despair, flashed past, their eyes burning into him with a mixture of accusation and pleading. He thrashed, trying to claw his way back towards the faint glimmer of light that represented the elevator, but the darkness held him fast. It seeped into his clothes, his skin, his very pores, filling him with a bone-chilling cold that seemed to emanate from his own bones. His own memories twisted and turned, morphing into grotesque parodies of reality. Then, as abruptly as it began, the falling stopped. Daniel landed heavily on a cold, hard surface. He lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, his body racked with tremors. As his vision cleared, He realized he was in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The walls appeared to be made of some kind of organic material, pulsing faintly with a sickly greenish light. Whispers followed him, slithering along the corridor like living things. They spoke of forgotten horrors, of unspeakable acts committed in the name of greed and ambition. The air itself felt thick with malevolence, a tangible presence that pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had a choice: remain paralyzed by fear, consumed by the darkness, or face the horrors that awaited him. Driven by a primal need to survive, to atone for the sins that haunted him, he chose the latter. He stumbled to his feet, each step an act of defiance against the unseen forces that sought to break him. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before him, twisting and turning in impossible configurations. The further he walked, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The whispers grew louder, the voices clearer, until he could make out individual words, phrases, sentences. They spoke of a debt that needed to be paid, a balance that needed to be restored. He began to see glimpses of other people trapped within the walls, their faces contorted in eternal torment. They reached out to him, their eyes pleading for release, for salvation. He recognized some of them, people he had worked with, passed on the street, even briefly encountered in his daily life. Each face, each voice served as a chilling reminder of the interconnectedness of all things, of the ripple effect that even the smallest actions could have. A terrifying thought took root in his mind. This wasn't just a place of punishment for his own sins, but a repository for the darkness that lurked within all of humanity. He was just one soul among countless others, drawn here by the weight of their collective guilt and shame. Finally, he reached a large circular chamber. A single figure stood in the center, shrouded in shadow. As Daniel approached, the figure turned, revealing the man from the elevator, but he was different now, his features sharper, his eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. He seemed to radiate power, his very presence warping the reality of the chamber around him.
You have seen the truth, Daniel. You understand the weight of your transgression. But there is a way to atone, a way to restore the balance.
Daniel felt a glimmer of hope, a lifeline in the suffocating darkness.
What must I do?
He asked, his voice hoarse with desperation. The man smiled, a chilling, predatory expression that sent shivers down Daniel's spine.
You must take my place, become the warden of this place, the keeper of the darkness. Only then can you find peace.
Daniel stared at the man. Become the warden? The keeper of this abyss of suffering? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Desperation gnawed at his terror. He had witnessed the torment, felt the weight of his sin. Was this his path to redemption? Could he spare others from this fate? He pictured Sarah's face among the tormented, her bright spirit extinguished, fueled a spark of courage. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could prevent others.
What happens if I refuse?
Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's smile widened, revealing rows of sharpened teeth.
Then you join them, of course. Your torment will fuel their agony, but as warden, you hold the power. You decide who enters, who suffers, who finds peace.
Daniel closed his eyes, drawing a shuddering breath. The darkness beckoned, promising oblivion, but another, more primal instinct took hold, a thirst for control, a desire to atone not through suffering, but through dominion. He had spent his life seeking control, chasing success, only to find himself a prisoner of his own ambition. Here, in this abyss of despair, he saw a twisted opportunity for redemption.
I accept.
He whispered, the word tasting like ash on his tongue. A jolt of energy surged through him, the darkness swirling around him like a hungry beast. He felt a chilling detachment settle over him, a sense of cold, calculating power replacing the terror that had consumed him moments before. He opened his eyes, no longer the terrified, guilt-ridden man who had stumbled into this place. The man his purpose served smiled one last time, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He faded then, dissolving into the shadows, his laughter echoing through the chamber as Daniel took his place at the center of the vortex. But as Daniel reached out, ready to claim his dominion over this dark kingdom, a chilling realization washed over him. He glanced down at his hand, watching in horror as it began to fade, the flesh turning translucent, skeletal. The man hadn't offered him redemption, he had tricked him. There was no warden, no keeper of the darkness, only another soul to fuel the abyss, another face to join the chorus of the damned. And as the last vestiges of his humanity slipped away, Daniel understood the terrible truth. He wasn't ending the cycle of torment. He was becoming another link in its ever-growing chain. The elevator, now nothing more than a distant memory, continued its ascent, carrying countless unsuspecting souls towards their own personal hells.